When you hear the word pirate, what comes to mind? Maybe Jack Sparrow swaggering across the deck with witty comebacks, or Luffy from One Piece, sailing the seas chasing dreams and treasure. Maybe it's TikTok edits of tall ships and sea shanties, romanticized into an aesthetic of adventure. But here's the truth. If you were actually born into the pirate life, you wouldn't survive. Not a year, maybe not even a month. Because the reality of piracy wasn't witty one-liners or magical treasures. It was disease rotting your gums until your teeth fell out. It was starvation, eating worm-ridden biscuits, crawling with maggots. It was storms that snapped masts like twigs and drowned half your crew in the Black Ocean. Forget Jack Sparrow's rum-soaked charm. Real pirates drank themselves half to death, because it was the only way to dull the pain. Forget anime adventures where every crew is a family. Real pirate crews turned on each other, stabbing comrades for a handful of silver and treasure, that legendary chest of gold coins. Most pirates never saw anything close to it. The average haul was cloth, grain, maybe barrels of fish. And even if you did strike it rich, you probably wouldn't live long enough to spend it. So buckle in, because we're about to strip away the myth, the romance, the pop culture fantasy, and take you into the brutal, bloody, disease-ridden world of real piracy. And trust me, once you know what it was really like to be a pirate, you'll never watch Pirates of the Caribbean the same way again. The illusion of freedom at sea. One of the biggest myths about pirates is freedom. People imagine they left behind rigid society and lived without rules, answering to no one. But this so-called freedom was often an illusion. A pirate ship ran on strict discipline and harsh codes. Crews signed articles that dictated everything. How treasure would be split, how disputes were settled, and even how you could be punished for breaking rules. Yes, compared to naval or merchant ships, pirates had more equality. Captains were often elected, and loot was shared more evenly. But this equality didn't erase the constant tension. Every man lived under the threat of sudden violence. Mutinies weren't rare. A captain who made poor decisions could be overthrown or killed. That meant freedom was less about living wild, and more about constantly watching your back. And beyond the ship, freedom meant isolation. Pirates were outlaws with nowhere safe to call home. They couldn't dock openly in most ports. They were chased by naval patrols and hunted like animals. Their freedom often meant endless wandering, always on the run, always uncertain if tomorrow would bring safety or death, food, or the lack of it. The Hollywood pirate feast, with roasted meats and overflowing rum, couldn't be further from reality. Food aboard pirate ships was often foul, spoiled, and scarce. Ships stored salted meat and hardtack biscuits, shock-hard bread infested with weevils. Drinking water turned slimy and green after weeks at sea. Hunger was a constant companion. Pirates often survived on whatever they could steal, meaning one voyage could see relative abundance, and the next could leave the crew gnawing on rotten scraps. Malnutrition was rampant. Scurvy, caused by lack of vitamin C, left gums bleeding and teeth falling out. And rum, yes, it was common, but it wasn't for celebration. It was often used to mask the taste of spoiled water or rotten food. Drinking heavily was a way to dull hunger, pain, and fear. Far from being endless parties, pirate meals were bleak affairs, filled with sickness, complaints, and desperation. Living conditions aboard the ship. Life on a pirate ship was miserable. The decks were crowded, stinking, and constantly wet. There was no privacy. Hammocks were strung so close together that men slept shoulder to shoulder, breathing in each other's sweat and coughs. Rats and lice thrived in the filth. Wounds rarely healed in the damp environment. Infections spread rapidly. With no real medical supplies, a cut on your leg could turn into gangrene. Pirates often carried scars, missing fingers, or worse. The famous image of a pirate with a peg leg wasn't just a fun trope, it was a grim reminder of how crude survival was when amputation was the only option. And then there was the smell. Imagine the stench of unwashed men, rotting food, stagnant water, vomit, and human waste all combined in the sweltering heat. You couldn't escape it. For months at a time, the ship was both your workplace and your prison. Disease, the silent killer. If naval battles didn't kill you, disease often did. Ships were floating incubators for sickness. Dysentery, smallpox, malaria, yellow fever, and typhus ravaged crews. Fleas, lice, and rats carried disease from man to man. The lack of fresh food and clean water meant weakened immune systems. Scurvy wasn't the only problem. Pirates in tropical waters often fell victim to mosquito-borne illnesses. A fever could sweep through the ship and kill half the crew in days. Medical care was crude bloodletting, herbal remedies, or nothing at all. Sometimes, the ship's carpenter doubled as the surgeon, hacking off limbs with saws while others held you down. Death at sea wasn't just likely, it was expected. And when a man died, his body was often thrown overboard with little ceremony, unless the crew was sentimental enough to stitch him into a hammock for a proper burial. For many pirates, disease was the slow, miserable end that no one sings songs about. Punishments and pirate justice. When most people imagine pirates, they think of wild freedom, no rules, no authority, and no consequences. But in reality, pirate ships were some of the most strictly ruled communities afloat. Without order, a voyage collapsed into mutiny and chaos within days. That's why nearly every pirate crew swore to a code of articles before leaving port. These weren't suggestions, they were law. The articles covered everything: how loot was divided, who got compensation if injured, even rules about gambling or fighting on board. But they also spelled out punishments, and those punishments could be terrifying. One of the most dreaded was marooning. A pirate found guilty of theft, betrayal, or cowardice might be set ashore on a barren island with nothing but a pistol and a little water. Alone under the burning sun, the man could try to survive, or use the pistol to end his misery. Most died slowly of thirst or starvation, which made marooning one of the most feared sentences among pirates. Another punishment, sometimes borrowed from naval tradition, was keel-hauling. The condemned was tied with ropes and dragged beneath the ship's barnacle-encrusted hull. Survivors emerged torn and bleeding, often with infections that killed them soon after. Few punishments inspired more dread. Not every crime warranted something so extreme. Sometimes men were flogged with the cat-o'-nine-tails tied to the mast until their backs were raw. Other times a traitor was simply executed quickly: a pistol shot, a plunge into the sea, or, rarely, the dramatic act of walking the plank. The irony is that pirate justice was both harsher and, in some ways, fairer than naval justice. Unlike the Royal Navy, where officers beat sailors at will, pirate codes applied to everyone. Even captains could be punished if they broke the articles. Discipline was necessary, but it was discipline the crew had agreed to. Still, the knowledge that one wrong move could see you abandoned on a desert island, bleeding from barnacle wounds, or dead by pistol must have cast a long shadow over daily life. Pirate freedom came at a price, and that price was living under the constant threat of brutal justice. The brutality of pirate battles. Pirate battles were not glamorous duels of flashing swords and witty one-liners. They were chaotic, deafening, and soaked in blood. Most pirate ships were not built for open naval warfare. Instead, they relied on speed and ambush. A pirate crew would stalk merchant vessels, waiting until the wind, weather, and distance favored them. When the moment came, the pirate ship surged forward, cannons roaring. But these were not precision weapons. They were brutal tools of destruction. Iron balls ripped through wood and flesh alike, splinters flying like daggers that could maim more effectively than the cannonball itself. The noise was deafening, the smoke choking, and visibility nearly impossible. If the cannons did not force a surrender, the pirates launched a boarding attack. Grappling hooks flew through the air, pulling ships together. Then came the real terror: hand-to-hand combat. Pirates wielded cutlasses, pistols, boarding axes, and daggers. Blood slicked the decks, men screamed as they were cut down, and the stench of gunpowder and gore filled the air. Victory meant plunder, but it also meant loss. Pirates were constantly injured: broken bones, slashed limbs, burns from powder explosions. Medical treatment was primitive at best. A severed arm might be cauterized with hot tar. A gut wound meant certain death. And because pirates had no national navy to care for them, a wounded man had only his shipmates and luck. It's worth remembering, most pirates wanted to avoid pitched battles. They relied on terror. The black flag itself was a weapon, a promise of no mercy if a ship resisted. But when battles came, they were nothing like the swashbuckling romances later written. They were closer to nightmares. Chaotic storms of noise, smoke, and slaughter where survival was uncertain, even for the victors. Food, drink, and the stench of life at sea. If you think pirate food was exotic feasts stolen from treasure ships, think again. Life at sea was one long battle against rot and hunger. A pirate's diet usually consisted of hardtack biscuits, rock-hard squares of flour and water baked until nearly inedible. Often they were infested with weevils. Pirates would tap the biscuit on the table to shake out the bugs, and then eat it anyway. Fresh meat and vegetables spoiled within days, leaving only salted pork or dried beans as staples. These too often went rancid or molded. Water was another nightmare. Barrels of fresh water quickly turned green and slimy. To make it drinkable, pirates often mixed it with alcohol, rum, wine, or beer. This led to the stereotype of drunken pirates, but the truth was that alcohol was safer than water. Rum became both medicine and morale booster, numbing hunger and dulling fear. And then there was the smell. A pirate ship was a floating cesspit, dozens of men crammed together in damp quarters, rarely washing, surrounded by rotting food, animal hides, and the stench of bilge water. Rats scurried across sleeping men, lice infested clothing, and the latrine was nothing more than a plank with a hole, hanging over the sea. Malnutrition was rampant. Without fruits and vegetables, pirates developed scurvy, bleeding gums, swollen joints, and eventually death. Imagine trying to swing from a rope or fight a battle while your teeth fell out and your bones ached. So while the image of pirates feasting on stolen banquets looks good in films, the reality was far grimmer. Every meal was a gamble against hunger, rot, and disease, served with a side of unbearable stench. The terrifying reality of scurvy and disease. Pirates feared not just enemies, but the slow killers that crept on board with every voyage. Disease. Scurvy was the worst. Caused by a lack of vitamin C, it turned strong men into limping wrecks. Their gums swelled until teeth fell out, old wounds split open again, skin bruised at the slightest touch, and the pain relentless. A crew suffering scurvy was almost helpless, barely able to stand, let alone fight. But scurvy wasn't the only danger. Ships were breeding grounds for dysentery, typhus, and fever. A single infected man could spread illness to the entire crew. With poor hygiene, no fresh food, and no doctors, death often came quicker than combat. Even small injuries could be fatal. A cut from a knife, untreated, might fester into gangrene. An infected tooth could swell into a deadly abscess, and surgeries were done with saws and knives. No anesthesia, and no sterilization. The screams of an amputation haunted crews long after the patient either survived or died in agony. To fight back, pirates had few remedies. Rum was poured on wounds, herbs chewed as medicine, and sometimes mercury was used for venereal disease, a cure often worse than the illness. For all their fierce reputations, pirates were fragile men at war with their own bodies. Death by cannonball was swift. Death by disease was slow, miserable, and far more common. The reality of pirate treasure. When we hear pirate treasure, we think of buried chests of gold. In reality, most pirate loot was far less glamorous. Merchant ships rarely carried gold. Instead, pirates seized cloth, sugar, tobacco, alcohol, spices, or weapons. These were valuable, yes, but hardly the kind of glittering fortune we imagine. A hold full of cocoa beans could be worth more than a chest of coins. Sometimes, pirates found silver or gold coins, but even then, they spent them quickly. Money went toward supplies, bribes, gambling, and women in port. Few pirates retired rich. Most died poor, their wealth squandered, and the idea of buried treasure, almost entirely myth. The one famous case is Captain Kidd, who buried some loot before capture. But pirates lived fast, knowing their days were numbered. They didn't hide treasure for the future. They spent it, often recklessly, on rum, gambling, and fleeting pleasures. For the average pirate, treasure wasn't gold doubloons. It was a decent meal, a share of plunder, or simply surviving another week at sea. Fear of the gallows. Every pirate lived under the shadow of the gallows. Captured pirates were rarely shown mercy. The punishment for piracy was death, by hanging. Once caught, pirates were hauled to trial, often little more than formalities. Witnesses described their crimes. The jury quickly agreed, and the sentence was read: execution. On the appointed day, crowds gathered. Pirates were marched to the scaffold, hands bound, sometimes jeered by angry townsfolk. At the rope's end, a pirate's final struggle was slow and undignified. Hanging was rarely quick. Many kicked and writhed as the noose strangled them. Worse still was the aftermath. Bodies were often coated in tar and displayed in cages along the shoreline, as a warning to others. Seabirds pecked at the corpses while passing. Sailors shuddered at the sight. Pirates dreamed of freedom, but almost all shared the same fate. A rope around the neck, swinging before a crowd. The romance of piracy ended not with treasure and glory, but with fear, shame, and an unmarked grave. The myth of pirate democracy. One of the strangest truths about pirates is that their ships often ran more democratically than the kingdoms and navies hunting them. Unlike the rigid hierarchy of the Royal Navy, pirates lived by codes that gave every man a voice. Before a voyage began, crews signed a pirate code, rules that determined how plunder would be divided. how injuries were compensated, and even how disputes were settled. Captains were elected, and though they commanded during battle, outside of combat they were often equal to their men. If the crew disliked a captain, they could vote to replace him. Shares of loot were distributed fairly. Captains and quartermasters earned more, but not extravagantly so. A common sailor might get one full share, while officers received 1.5 or 2. If you lost a leg or an arm in service, you might be compensated with extra treasure, a crude form of insurance. But this democracy wasn't pure freedom. Rules were strict. Stealing from your fellow crew could mean death. Cowardice in battle was punishable by whipping or maroning. And while voting existed, authority during a fight was absolute. Hesitation could doom everyone. This strange blend of liberty and brutality made pirate ships both freer and harsher than life on land. For men escaping the tyranny of monarchs, landlords, or navy captains, piracy offered a taste of equality. But it came with constant risk: the sea, disease, and the gallows, the weapons of pirates. Forget polished sabers and gleaming pistols from Hollywood. Real pirate weapons were messy, crude, and terrifying. The cutlass was the weapon of choice, a short, heavy sword designed for close combat on crowded decks. Its wide blade hacked through ropes, wood, and flesh with equal ease. Pirates preferred it because it was cheap, simple, and deadly in tight quarters. They also carried boarding axes, useful both for combat and chopping through ship rigging. Pistols were single-shot flintlocks, often unreliable and slow to reload. Most pirates carried several at once, tucked into belts, so they could fire multiple times before switching to blades. And then there were the truly vicious weapons: granados, small hand-thrown bombs, filled with gunpowder and shrapnel, blunderbusses, short-barreled firearms that sprayed lead like an early shotgun, and even makeshift clubs wrapped in nails or spikes. Pirates had no luxury of fine equipment. Their arsenal was brutal, practical, and terrifying. Designed not for elegance but for fear. The sight of a boarding crew armed with axes, pistols, and cutlasses was often enough to make sailors surrender without firing a shot. The art of terror. Pirates knew that fear was more powerful than firepower. Their most effective weapon wasn't cannon or cutlass, it was reputation. When a pirate flag rose on the horizon, it carried a promise: surrender or die. Different flags meant different fates. The Jolly Roger, with skull and crossbones, warned of battle. A red flag meant no quarter. No mercy would be given. Sailors who saw it often dropped their weapons immediately. Pirates also cultivated terrifying personas. Blackbeard, for example, tied burning fuses into his beard, surrounding himself in smoke as if he were a demon risen from hell. Others displayed severed heads on their bowsprits or mutilated prisoners to spread fear. Terror wasn't mindless cruelty, it was strategy. A merchant crew that believed pirates would slaughter them was far more likely to surrender without resistance. That meant fewer battles, fewer injuries, and quicker plunder. So while stories of pirates torturing captives sound horrific, and many were true, they served a purpose. Fear was the cheapest weapon in a pirate's arsenal, and it often brought victory before the first shot was fired. Women on pirate ships. Though most pirates were men, women did sail the seas, and their stories were extraordinary. The most famous were Anne Bonny and Mary Read, who dressed as men and fought alongside male pirates. Witnesses claimed they were as fierce, if not fiercer, than their shipmates. Both were eventually captured, and both avoided execution by claiming to be pregnant, a common but temporary reprieve. Women on pirate ships broke every convention of the age. At a time when most women were confined to domestic roles, they wielded pistols and cutlasses, cursing, fighting, and commanding respect. Crews sometimes accepted them, other times feared them as bad luck. But not all women were fighters. Some were captives, forced into life aboard ship. Others worked in ports, where pirate money flowed into taverns and brothels. For these women, piracy meant both opportunity and exploitation. The presence of women challenged a macho image of piracy. They showed that the lure of freedom and fortune crossed gender lines, and that survival at sea depended more on strength and cunning than on social convention. Ports of sin. Pirates lived wild lives at sea, but their time in port was even more infamous. Havens like Nassau in the Bahamas or Tortuga in the Caribbean became pirate strongholds. There, pirates spent their plunder on gambling, drinking, and women. Taverns overflowed with rum, dice rolled across tables, and songs of rebellion echoed late into the night. These ports were lawless melting pots. Sailors, escaped slaves, merchants, and criminals mingled. Smugglers traded stolen goods, corrupt officials turned a blind eye for bribes, and pirate crews plotted their next raids. But paradise never lasted. Diseases spread quickly, fights broke out nightly, and money vanished faster than it was earned. A pirate could blow his entire fortune in a week of debauchery. Still, for men who had risked death at sea, these wild ports offered a brief taste of freedom and indulgence. They were the beating heart of the pirate world, chaotic, dangerous, and intoxicating, just like piracy itself. The endless hunger at sea. Pirate ships weren't stocked with fresh food. Once a voyage stretched beyond a week or two, supplies began to rot. Meat turned rancid, bread grew moldy, and water barrels filled with green slime and insects. The standard diet was hardtack, a rock-hard biscuit of flour and water, often crawling with weevils. Pirates joked that you could eat the biscuit or the bugs, and either way you'd get your protein. Salted beef or pork was another staple, but after weeks at sea, it stank so badly that only the most desperate men touched it. Fresh fruit was a rare treasure, but without it, scurvy spread quickly, gums swelled, teeth fell out, and bodies grew weak. Imagine trying to climb rigging or swing a cutlass with your joints aching and your mouth bleeding. When starvation grew dire, pirates sometimes boiled leather, ate rats, or even stripped the sails for soup made from canvas and grease. Stories of cannibalism aboard stranded ships haunted every sailor, and while rare, they were not impossible. The sea offered wealth, yes, but it also offered gnawing hunger, thirst, and the slow decay of the human body. For every pirate who returned to port with gold, there were dozens who wasted away in silence, their bones scattered by the waves. Disease, the silent enemy. If hunger didn't kill you, disease probably would. Pirates lived in cramped, filthy conditions, packed into wooden ships that reeked of sweat, gunpowder, and sewage. A single sick man could infect the whole crew in days. Scurvy, as mentioned, was ever present, but it was joined by dysentery, a disease that spread through contaminated food and water. Crews weakened by diarrhea and dehydration were barely able to fight when enemies appeared. Malaria and yellow fever ravaged pirate ports in the Caribbean. Mosquitoes carried these diseases, and without understanding their cause, pirates had no defense. One bite could mean fever, delirium, and death. Even minor wounds were deadly. A cut from a cutlass or splinter from the deck could turn gangrenous. With no antibiotics, infections spread rapidly. The treatment? Amputation, if you were lucky enough to have a ship's surgeon. Most didn't. And yet, pirates kept sailing. The lure of gold outweighed the certainty of disease. In some ways, they accepted sickness as part of the bargain. To live as a pirate meant living on borrowed time. Every day was a gamble against the body's slow collapse. Mutiny and betrayal. Pirate democracy worked, until it didn't. Crews could vote on leaders, but the same freedom that empowered them also fueled betrayal. Mutiny wasn't uncommon. If a captain grew too cautious, too greedy, or too brutal, the men might rise against him. Sometimes this meant simply deposing him and voting in a new leader. Other times, it meant violence. Captains were beaten, marooned on deserted islands, or thrown overboard. But betrayal didn't stop at the ship's rail. Pirates also betrayed one another for freedom or fortune. A captured pirate might turn informant, revealing safe harbors or hidden treasure caches to save his own neck. Whole crews were undone by one man's betrayal. The problem was trust. Pirates swore oaths of loyalty, but when faced with the gallows or torture, many broke. In some cases, kings offered pardons, amnesty for pirates who turned themselves in. Crews splintered, friendships ended in blood, and ships dissolved into chaos. The sea may have united men in pursuit of wealth, but greed and fear always lurked beneath the surface. The brotherhood of pirates was fragile, and betrayal was as sharp a blade as any cutlass. The myth of pirate treasure. We love the idea of pirates burying treasure on deserted islands, X marking the spot. But the truth, almost no pirates did this. Pirate life was too uncertain for hoarding. Most plunder was spent as soon as it was taken. Crews squandered gold on rum, gambling, and women in port. Many pirates died penniless within months of their greatest raid. Treasure itself was rarely gold coins. More often pirates seized cargo. Sugar, tobacco, indigo, cocoa, cotton, spices, or slaves. These goods were sold on black markets for quick profit. The legendary chests of glittering jewels were the exception, not the rule. The myth of buried treasure comes largely from literature, especially Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island. While a few pirates may have hidden loot temporarily, none made a habit of it. The true treasure of a pirate's life was fleeting, the taste of rum, the thrill of freedom, the roar of cannons, and just as quickly as it was won, it was lost. The final fate of pirates, for most pirates, the story ended not with wealth, but with the noose. Captured pirates were paraded into port, tried quickly, and sentenced to hang. Executions were public, meant to terrify would-be raiders. Sometimes dozens were hanged together, their bodies left dangling as warnings. In London, bodies of pirates were coated in tar and displayed in iron cages along the Thames, their corpses swinging for months. In the Caribbean, gallows stood near harbors, greeting every ship with the sight of rotting bodies. A lucky few accepted royal pardons, settling quietly into obscurity. Some became privateers again, serving the very crowns they once robbed, but most died young, often before the age of 30. The romance of piracy, the freedom, the gold, the songs of the sea, was always haunted by this grim reality. Every pirate knew that sooner or later, the sea would claim them, or the hangman would. For all its allure, piracy was less a life than a wager, and almost always, the house won. The brutal code of punishment. Pirates lived outside the law of kings, but that didn't mean they lived without laws. Every crew created its own pirate code, a set of rules that bound them together. Break those rules, and the punishment was severe. Stealing from another pirate was one of the gravest crimes. Loot was to be shared equally, and anyone caught pocketing more than his fair share faced flogging, mutilation, or even death. Cheating at dice or cards brought similar punishments, since gambling was a favorite pastime. Desertion was punished by maroning, abandoning the offender on a deserted island with nothing but a pistol and a bottle of water. The condemned man could use the pistol to hunt, or, if despair overcame him, to end his own suffering. Few survived long. Cowardice in battle was also unforgivable. Pirates demanded bravery, and any man who shirked his duty when the cannons roared could be executed on the spot. Some codes even banned bringing women aboard ship, claiming they sowed jealousy and discord. Men who broke this rule risked deadly fights or strict punishment. These codes weren't written to protect morality, they were practical. On a cramped ship where tempers ran hot and life was cheap, rules kept chaos at bay. Without discipline, a pirate ship could collapse into anarchy within hours. The code was their fragile thread of order, a reminder that even in lawlessness, there had to be law. Women among pirates. While most pirates were men, women did exist among them, and their lives were even harsher than their male counterparts. Two of the most famous were Anne Bonny and Mary Read, who disguised themselves as men before revealing their true identities. Both fought fiercely in battles and gained reputations as ruthless as any man's. But life for most women tied to piracy was grim. Female captives were often abused, sold into slavery, or left behind after raids. Even women who willingly joined pirates were rare, since the risks were enormous. Those who did succeed, like Anne and Mary, did so by adopting the violence of their world. Their survival depended on proving they were as merciless as the men around them. Stories tell of Anne Bonny shouting to her captured crew, "If you had fought like men, you wouldn't be hanged like dogs." Women in port towns fared little better. Many taverns and brothels were directly supported by pirate money. For these women, pirates represented both opportunity and danger, fleeting wealth, but also the risk of disease, abuse, or sudden abandonment. In truth, piracy left little space for women, except as symbols of temptation or targets of violence. The sea was an unforgiving master, and it demanded blood and strength from anyone who sailed upon it. Life between raids. When pirates weren't raiding ships, their lives were a strange mixture of boredom and brutality. Days at sea stretched endlessly. The horizon never changed, and the work of maintaining a ship was grueling. Scrubbing decks, repairing sails, hauling ropes, and standing endless watches at night. Entertainment was crude. Pirates played dice and cards, told bawdy stories, or sang shanties to pass the time. Drinking was constant when supplies allowed, though drunkenness could quickly spiral into brawls. Weapons required constant care. Pistols and cutlasses had to be cleaned, gunpowder kept dry, and cannons maintained. A rusty blade or damp powder could mean death in battle. Superstition also filled the empty hours. Many pirates believed whistling on deck could summon storms. Some thought women on board brought bad luck, while others tattooed charms or carried talismans to ward off drowning. But always tension lingered. Every sail spotted on the horizon could mean a prize, or a deadly trap. Every calm sea could suddenly whip into a hurricane. The in-between moments were not peaceful. They were suspense stretched thin, like a rope about to snap. Pirate life wasn't all roaring cannons and flashing swords. It was long days of sunburn, hunger, suspicion, and the constant waiting for the next chance at fortune or death. The psychology of fear. To be a pirate was to live under constant fear, not just of death, but of the unknown. Storms struck without warning, diseases struck without cure, and enemies struck without mercy. Yet pirates cultivated an image of fearlessness, laughing in the face of danger. This bravado was often a mask. Many pirates drank heavily to dull their terror. Others embraced violence with an almost suicidal frenzy, rushing into battle because fear of hesitation was worse than fear of death. Captains used fear as a weapon. Blackbeard, for example, tied slow-burning fuses into his beard and hat during battle, surrounding himself with smoke and sparks. He looked like a demon risen from the sea, terrifying his enemies, and perhaps even his own crew. But fear also bound pirates together. In the face of storms or combat, men relied on one another with desperate loyalty. Brotherhood wasn't just camaraderie, it was survival. A man who failed his fellows might not only be punished, but left to die when the ship next faced danger. Fear shaped every decision, every raid, every night spent staring into the dark sea. Pirates may have chased freedom, but they were also prisoners of dread, their lives haunted by death in 100 forms. The legacy of piracy. Piracy's golden age burned brightly, but briefly. By the early 18th century, empires grew stronger, navies larger, and pirate havens were crushed one by one. Yet their legacy lived on, and continues to live on today. Part of that legacy is myth. Stories of buried treasure, Jolly Roger flags, and dashing rogues with eye patches. Popular novels and Hollywood films transformed cutthroats into romantic adventurers, erasing much of the brutality. But another legacy is very real. Pirates challenged the rigid hierarchies of their time. On their ships, leadership could be elected, loot shared, and men of all nations worked side by side. Some historians even call pirate ships early experiments in democracy. The darker legacy is blood and suffering. Merchant sailors, enslaved people, and villagers along coastlines all bore the scars of pirate raids. To them, piracy was terror, not freedom. Today, pirates remain symbols of rebellion against authority, a fantasy of absolute freedom on the open sea. But the truth, the hunger, disease, betrayal, and death, was far harsher, and that truth is what makes their story so haunting. The slow death of disease. Among the deadliest enemies pirates ever faced was not the navy, nor rival crews, but disease. The cramped, filthy conditions of a ship were the perfect breeding ground for sickness. Scurvy was the most infamous, caused by lack of vitamin C. It left men weak, their gums rotting, their teeth falling out, their skin spotted with ulcers. Once a pirate's body began wasting from scurvy, there was little hope of recovery. But scurvy wasn't alone. Dysentery spread like wildfire, turning clean water barrels into poison. Typhus, spread by lice, caused fever and delirium that could sweep through a crew in weeks. Malaria and yellow fever struck when pirates raided tropical ports. Even smallpox, carried unknowingly on board, could wipe out entire crews in months. Medicine on pirate ships was crude. A surgeon might be nothing more than a carpenter with a saw and a steady hand. Amputations were common for wounds that became infected, often done without anesthetic. While the patient bit down on a rag and screamed, some pirates tried remedies. Citrus fruits when available, tobacco smoke blown into the rectum to revive the dying, or bleeding a patient to balance their humors. Most of these cures only made things worse. For a pirate, disease was inescapable. They may have faced battle with a cutlass, but disease attacked them silently, day after day, until death came quietly in the dark. The illusion of treasure. The dream of endless gold drew many to piracy, but the reality was far different. Movies tell us of buried treasure chests, but pirates rarely buried their loot. They spent it as quickly as they stole it. A captured merchant ship might hold bolts of cloth, barrels of grain, or crates of tobacco, valuable, but not glittering treasure. Gold and silver were rare prizes, and even then, the spoils had to be divided according to the pirate code. A captain might receive 2 or 3 shares, the quartermaster 1.5, gunners and skilled men 1.25, and the rest a single share each. After expenses for gunpowder, repairs, and bribes, most pirates found themselves with surprisingly little, and when they did have money, they wasted it in drunken binges at pirate ports like Nassau or Tortuga. In a few nights, years of danger and bloodshed could be reduced to nothing but empty pockets and aching heads. The myth of treasure, golden islands, secret maps, buried chests, grew later, from novels like Treasure Island. But for real pirates, treasure was fleeting, almost always disappointing, and never enough to justify the pain they endured. The illusion of riches was one of piracy's greatest lies. Men risked everything, not realizing they were more likely to die poor than live rich. Storms, shipwrecks, and the fury of the sea. If battle didn't kill you, the sea itself might. Pirates sailed in an age before accurate weather prediction, and storms were terrifying, unstoppable forces. A hurricane could rise seemingly out of nowhere. One moment, the sea was calm. The next, towering waves crashed against the ship, tearing sails to ribbons and snapping masts like twigs. Crews worked frantically to cut rigging and pump out water, but often it wasn't enough. Shipwreck was a constant danger. Pirates knew how to navigate with the stars and crude maps, but reefs, shoals, and hidden rocks claimed countless vessels. A ship driven onto a reef was smashed apart within hours, scattering men into the sea. Even calm weather had its dangers. A long becoming, days without wind, meant no movement, no escape, and dwindling food and water. Men grew restless, paranoid, and violent, blaming each other or cursing their captain as the sun baked them alive. Survivors of shipwrecks sometimes found themselves stranded on deserted islands. These were not tropical paradises, but barren stretches of rock and scrub. Without supplies, many slowly starved, or were driven mad by thirst. For all their bravado, pirates were powerless before the sea. Every voyage was a gamble against nature itself, and more than one crew found their watery grave without a single shot fired. The end of the Golden Age. By the early 18th century, piracy's glory days were numbered. The very forces that had allowed it to flourish, weak colonial control, warring empires, and scattered trade routes were tightening. Navies grew larger and more disciplined. Britain, France, and Spain deployed warships to patrol the Caribbean and Atlantic, hunting pirates relentlessly. Merchant ships began sailing in armed convoys, making them harder to attack. Pirate havens were systematically destroyed. Nassau, once the Republic of Pirates, was retaken by the British. Its taverns and brothels shuttered, its ships burned. Tortuga, Port Royal, and other strongholds were crushed under military rule. Many pirates accepted pardons, laying down their weapons in exchange for freedom. Others, like Blackbeard, fought to the bitter end, dying in bloody battles that became legends. By 1726, the Great Age of Piracy was over. The world had grown too organized, too powerful, too merciless to allow freebooters to thrive. The last major executions of pirates were public spectacles, meant to warn anyone dreaming of following in their footsteps. Yet, even in death, piracy lived on in memory, growing into legend. The end of the Golden Age was only the beginning of the myth. The shadow of the pirate. Though piracy as an organized force died, its shadow remained. Sailors still told tales of ghost ships, haunted by the spirits of drowned pirates. Coastal towns whispered of hidden treasure, luring men into fruitless searches. The image of the pirate, ruthless yet free, savage yet independent, lingered in the imagination. Writers and storytellers reshaped them, turning cutthroats into heroes, villains, and everything in between. Even today, piracy hasn't vanished. Off the coasts of Africa and Asia, modern pirates still raid ships, though with speedboats and rifles instead of cutlasses and cannons. The motives remain the same: desperation, greed, and survival. The legacy of pirates is complicated. They were criminals, but also symbols of resistance. They were murderers, but also dreamers chasing freedom on the open sea. Their real lives were filled with disease, hunger, pain, and death, but the myths they inspired remain irresistible. To understand pirates fully is to embrace both sides, the horror and the romance, the truth and the legend. And perhaps that is why their story never dies, because it reflects humanity's darkest urges and wildest dreams, bound together forever on the endless, merciless sea. The brutal discipline of pirate life. Despite their reputation as lawless rogues, pirate crews were not free-for-alls of chaos. Life aboard required order, and discipline was often far harsher than what men faced in the navies they deserted. The pirate code, each crew had its own variation, spelled out punishments for theft, cowardice, or betrayal. A man who stole from his crewmates could be marooned, left on a deserted island with only a pistol and one shot. Another who broke rules might face flogging, stripped to the waist, tied to the mast, and whipped until flesh peeled from bone. Then there was keel-hauling, one of the most dreaded punishments. The condemned sailor was tied with rope and dragged beneath the barnacle-crusted hull of the ship. The razor-sharp shells shredded skin, while drowning threatened at every pull. Few survived, and those who did carried scars for life. Discipline extended beyond punishment. Pirates had to fight constantly to prove their worth. A man who shirked work, who showed fear in battle, or who disrespected officers was often beaten or cast off. Unlike Navy men, pirates chose their captains, but once chosen, obedience was absolute. The irony was clear: men had fled the brutal hierarchy of naval life, only to end up in a world just as cruel, governed not by kings but by codes that demanded blood and loyalty in equal measure. Women at sea, myth and reality. The popular image of the pirate world is overwhelmingly male, but history records a handful of women who lived and fought as pirates. Yet their lives reveal just how dangerous and unusual female piracy was. Anne Bonny and Mary Read are the most famous. Disguised as men at first, they carved reputations as fierce fighters, standing shoulder to shoulder with crews who at first had no idea they were women. Their courage became legendary, but their stories ended in capture and imprisonment, not riches. Women were otherwise rare aboard ships, often considered bad luck. When present, they were usually captives, slaves, or coerced companions. Pirate havens like Nassau, however, drew women into their orbit. Prostitutes, barmaids, and camp followers who lived in the shadow of the cup. Some pirate codes even forbade bringing women on board, recognizing the chaos and violence it could spark among desperate men. Yet history hints that a few women slipped into crews by choice, disguising themselves and fighting as equals until discovered. For most, the sea was no place for them. The pirates' world was harsh, brutal, and unforgiving, even more so for women, who faced the double burden of survival and exposure in a world that had no place for them. The price of fear, torture, and interrogation. When pirates captured a ship, they weren't always content with loot. They often wanted information: where ships were sailing, where treasure might be hidden, which ports were weakest. To get answers, they used torture. Prisoners could be tied to the mast and flogged until they confessed. Others were suspended by their thumbs, their joints dislocated. Some endured the boot, where legs were crushed between boards tightened with wedges. The most feared was the sweating method. Victims were locked in a small, airless room while pirates lit candles and torches, turning the space into a sweltering furnace. As the prisoner gasped for air and sweat poured down their body, they either gave up secrets or collapsed in agony. And then there was psychological terror. Pirates sometimes threatened captives with execution or mutilation, only to spare them at the last moment, ensuring that word of their cruelty spread to every port. This was deliberate. Fear was a weapon as sharp as any sword. If merchant crews surrendered without a fight, pirates saved powder, shot, and lived. The brutality wasn't random, it was strategy, designed to make their reputations more terrifying than any navy flag. But for those who suffered at pirate hands, it was no strategy at all. It was pain, humiliation, and horror that lingered long after the pirates had sailed away. The daily grind of a pirate ship. Beyond battles, treasure, and legends, most of pirate life was tedious, exhausting, and dull. A day aboard ship meant endless work: patching sails, repairing rigging, scrubbing decks, pumping water from the bilge, and constantly watching for leaks. Food was monotonous: hardtack biscuits crawling with weevils, salted meat that smelled of rot, and dried peas or beans. Fresh food was rare and spoiled quickly. Water stored in barrels often turned green, slimy and foul-tasting, filled with worms and algae. Living conditions were cramped. Dozens of men crammed into a single, dark, damp space below decks, sleeping in hammocks or directly on the wood. Rats and lice thrived, gnawing at food stores and feasting on the men themselves. Entertainment was scarce. Pirates gambled with dice, told filthy jokes, sang bawdy songs, or carved wooden trinkets. Quarrels often broke out, leading to fistfights, or worse. Boredom was an enemy as constant as hunger. And yet, for all the hardship, pirates endured it because the alternative life as a navy sailor or peasant laborer was often worse. At least on a pirate ship, there was the hope of plunder, the taste of rum, and the fleeting sense of freedom beneath the sails. The grind of daily life was the hidden reality of piracy. Not glory, not treasure, but endless toil, sickness, and waiting for a chance that might never come. The afterlife of a pirate. Death was constant at sea, but for pirates, what happened after was often as grim as life itself. Those killed in battle might be thrown overboard, their bodies claimed by sharks within minutes. Sometimes a quick prayer was muttered. More often there was no ceremony at all. The sea swallowed its dead without care. Executions were worse. Captured pirates were hanged in public, their bodies left to rot in gibbets. Iron cages hung along the shore. For months, the corpses swung in the wind, a grim warning to others. Sailors passing by saw them as both omen and curse. Superstitions abounded. Some pirates believed, those denied a proper burial haunted the waves, returning as ghostly lights or phantom ships. Tales of spectral captains with glowing eyes or fleets of the damned spread fear among sailors. Others believed in Davy Jones' locker, a watery grave where the souls of drowned sailors were trapped forever. For pirates, this fate seemed all but inevitable, as few expected to die in bed. The afterlife of a pirate was not glory, not legend, but silence beneath the waves or humiliation on the gallows. And yet, for many, it was worth the risk. Better to live as a pirate and die young, they thought, than rot in poverty on land. The endless hunt for fresh water. More than gold, more than rum, more than gunpowder. Fresh water was the lifeblood of a pirate ship. Without it, crews weakened, sickened, and died. Yet finding clean water at sea was one of the greatest struggles. Ships carried casks filled with river water collected in port, but within weeks the liquid turned foul. It grew thick with algae, crawling with worms, and reeked of rot. Sailors gagged as they drank, plugging their noses just to swallow. Sometimes men strained the muck through cloth, but it was never enough to stop dysentery. When water ran low, pirates were forced to desperate measures. They captured merchant ships, not for treasure, but for their barrels of fresh supplies. They risked anchoring near uncharted islands, sending men ashore with buckets to fill from streams, always wary of ambush. Rain was a blessing. Pirates spread out sails and canvas to catch every drop, funneling it into casks. But storms were unpredictable, and many voyages endured weeks without rain. Men grew delirious, lips cracked, tongues swollen. Some drank seawater in desperation, only to go mad before death. The lack of water shaped pirate life more than legend admits. The strongest sword meant little if a man was too weak to stand. Treasure mattered less than survival. And for every ship that sank in battle, another was undone quietly, invisibly, by thirst. Diseases of the pirate world. If thirst didn't kill you, disease would. Life aboard a pirate ship was a breeding ground for sickness, and few men ever sailed long without succumbing. Scurvy was the most infamous, a slow, agonizing wasting disease caused by lack of vitamin C. Gums swelled and bled until teeth fell out. Old wounds reopened, festering with infection. Skin turned yellow and loose, muscles ached, and men wasted away into walking corpses. But scurvy was only the beginning. Dysentery spread from foul water, leaving men weak, feverish, and dehydrated. Typhus, carried by lice, swept through crowded hammocks below deck. Smallpox occasionally flared, scarring survivors for life. Syphilis and gonorrhea haunted pirate havens where brothels flourished. Sailors brought these diseases aboard, where treatments were worse than the sickness itself. Mercury rubs, cauterization, and painful surgeries that often ended in death. Even minor wounds could be fatal. A cut from rigging or a musket ball, untreated in the humid, filthy air, turned gangrenous within days. Surgeons hacked away limbs with saws, using rum for anesthesia and cauterizing stumps with red-hot irons. The average pirate's lifespan wasn't shortened only by battle or the gallows. Disease was a constant, invisible predator. In truth, most pirates died not in glory, but sweating, moaning, and forgotten below deck. The treasures that weren't gold. When we imagine pirates, we think of overflowing chests of gold and jewels, but the reality was far less romantic. Most pirate treasure wasn't riches at all. It was the simple stuff of survival. Pirates craved food, water, tools, weapons, and medicine. A cargo of salted beef or barrels of beer was worth more to them than silver coins. Cloth for sails, tar for repairs, or spare rigging lines could keep a ship alive. Textiles, tobacco, and sugar were some of the most common prizes. Pirates sold these in black markets, trading them for rum, powder, or coin. Rarely did they find golden chalices or gemstone necklaces. Those belonged more to fantasy than fact. When actual money was seized, it rarely lasted. Pirates spent it recklessly in ports, gambling, drinking, and buying companionship. Within weeks, many found themselves broke again, forced to sail back into danger for another score. The myth of buried treasure, too, is largely fiction. Pirates had little reason to bury their loot. Most blew through it fast, knowing life was short. The real treasure wasn't gold, but the fleeting chance to live like kings for a few nights in a tavern before returning to hunger, disease, and fear. Life in pirate havens. While life at sea was brutal, pirate havens offered a brief, intoxicating taste of freedom. Places like Nassau in the Bahamas, Port Royal in Jamaica, or Tortuga off Hispaniola became infamous for their lawlessness and excess. Here, pirates found everything denied to them on ship: women, drink, music, and reckless abandon. Taverns overflowed with rum, dice games, and shouting. Prostitutes plied their trade openly, earning as much as pirates themselves. Brawls erupted nightly, and gunshots echoed through the streets until dawn. Merchants, though technically enemies, thrived too. They bought stolen goods at discount and sold supplies at outrageous markups. The very communities that cursed piracy also quietly depended on it. But havens weren't only about pleasure. They were centers of politics, where pirates formed alliances, sold prizes, and negotiated with corrupt governors who looked the other way in exchange for bribes. Some havens became pirate republics in all but name, run not by kings, but by the crews themselves. Yet these oases were fragile. At any moment, naval fleets could descend, torching towns, hanging captured pirates, and restoring order. For many, the memory of nights in Nassau or Tortuga was the sweetest part of their lives. Fleeting glimpses of freedom that would never come again. The collapse of the Golden Age. By the early 18th century, piracy reached its peak, but its decline was swift and merciless. Governments, furious at the chaos inflicted on trade, launched a coordinated crackdown. Naval fleets grew stronger, faster, and better armed. Where once pirates preyed easily on merchant ships, they now faced heavily guarded convoys and relentless pursuit. Colonial governors who once tolerated pirates were pressured into action, signing treaties and hanging men they once bribed. Captured pirates were executed en masse. Gallows across the Caribbean and Europe groaned beneath the weight of bodies, while gibbets displayed rotting corpses as public warnings. Fear, once a pirate weapon, became their enemy. The romance of piracy evaporated. Fewer sailors joined crews when the odds of capture grew so high. Havens like Nassau were burned or taken over. By the 1730s, the so-called Golden Age was over, replaced by organized smuggling and privateering that lacked the wild freedom of old. But the legend lived on. Ballads, plays, and later novels transformed pirates into larger-than-life figures, more myth than reality. The truth of hunger, thirst, disease, and the gallows faded into memory. And so, piracy, as the world remembers it, ended, not with treasure buried beneath palm trees, but with blood on the scaffold, and with the sea reclaiming the men who once defied kings and nations. Storms, the true enemy of pirates. Cannons and cutlasses may fill the stories, but the deadliest foe pirates ever faced wasn't human, it was the sea itself. Storms struck without mercy, swallowing entire crews in a single night. On the open ocean, a ship was no more than a fragile wooden box. Pirates preyed against hurricanes in the Caribbean, monsoons in the Indian Ocean, and sudden tempests on the Atlantic crossing. Sails tore to ribbons, masts snapped like twigs, and men were flung into black water where no rescue was possible. Lightning lit the sky, and thunder boomed so loud it rattled bones. Waves rose higher than houses, crashing onto decks and sweeping sailors away. In such moments, no amount of courage mattered. Even the most hardened pirate fell to his knees, clutching wood slick with rain, whispering desperate prayers. Survival depended on seamanship. Crews scrambled to reef sails, pump out water, and keep the ship facing waves head-on. But exhaustion set in fast. Men worked until their hands bled, until arms could no longer lift rope. After the storm, survivors often found themselves stranded at sea with broken masts, spoiled supplies, and half their crew drowned. Some limped back to port with tales of hell. Others were never seen again, their ships swallowed whole by the sea. For all their violence, pirates never controlled their fate. Nature always had the final word. The brutality of naval battles. When storms spared them, the navy did not. Pirates lived in constant fear of warships, for unlike slow merchantmen, naval vessels were trained, disciplined, and merciless. A pirate ship might carry 6 or 12 cannons. A navy frigate carried 40 or more, with trained gunners able to fire in devastating broadsides. When the two met, the result was often slaughter. Pirates tried to avoid open battle. They relied on speed, trickery, and intimidation. But when cornered, the fight was a nightmare. Cannonballs ripped through wood, sending splinters flying like knives. Limbs were severed, skulls shattered, and decks painted red. Smoke filled the air, choking men as they loaded muskets and swung cutlasses. Hand-to-hand combat was brutal. Grappling hooks drew ships together, and men clambered over railings to kill or be killed. The chaos was deafening. Screaming men, cracking wood, booming guns. Captured pirates begged for mercy, but few were granted it. Navy officers saw them not as men, but as traitors to civilization. Survivors were chained and hauled to port, where trials ended swiftly, almost always in hanging. For all the romantic paintings of naval clashes, reality was blood, terror, and hopeless odds. Victory was rare. More often, pirate crews were massacred or dragged to the gallows, leaving only stories of defiance behind, torture and execution. If captured, a pirate's suffering was far from over. The authorities made examples of them, using torture and execution to terrify others away from the trade. Public trials were little more than formalities. Evidence was read, the accused shouted their defense, and within hours, sentences were declared, death by hanging. But hanging was not the worst. Some pirates were hanged in chains, left to rot in gibbets along harbors, their corpses swaying as warnings. Birds pecked at eyes, flesh turned black, and the stench carried for miles. Locals pointed to the bodies to remind children, this is the price of piracy. Others faced more inventive punishments. Spain and France sometimes broke bones on the wheel. England occasionally burned ships with prisoners aboard. Torture was used in interrogations, thumbscrews, whippings, starvation, or keel-hauling, dragging a man beneath a ship's barnacle-encrusted hull until his flesh tore away. Some pirates met death defiantly. They mocked judges, laughed at executioners, and shouted curses as the noose tightened. Black Bart Roberts, one of the most feared captains, was killed in battle rather than face capture. Others chose suicide at sea, preferring the deep over the rope. In the end, the gallows claimed more pirates than cannon or cutlass ever did. The sea may have been cruel, but governments were crueler still. The women of piracy. Though piracy is often painted as a man's world, women carved their own brutal paths upon the sea. Their stories were rare, but unforgettable. Anne Bonny and Mary Read stand as the most infamous. Both disguised themselves as men to gain freedom from the restrictions of society. Fierce in battle, quick with pistols, they fought alongside crews without hesitation. Legends say they cursed louder, drank harder, and killed quicker than many of their male comrades. But female pirates faced double danger. If captured, they were not only criminals but also seen as unnatural, defying the roles society demanded of women. Some were executed outright, others imprisoned. A few escaped fate by claiming pregnancy, buying themselves temporary reprieve under law. Beyond the deck, women played key roles in pirate havens. They ran taverns, sold goods, and traded information. Prostitutes risked disease and violence to serve crews flush with stolen coin, yet some became partners in crime, sharing loot or influencing deals. The image of the female pirate was both feared and sensationalized. Ballads and pamphlets turned Anne and Mary into near-myths, symbols of rebellion. In truth, most women connected to piracy lived hard, short lives, but their defiance carved cracks into a rigid world, proving the sea had room for more than one kind of outlaw, the forgotten pirates of the East. While the Caribbean dominates pirate lore, vast oceans elsewhere harbored their own outlaws. In the Indian Ocean and South China Sea, piracy thrived just as fiercely, though their tales are less told. European pirates like Henry Every and Thomas Chew struck Mughal treasure ships in the late 1600s, seizing fortunes so vast they sparked international outrage. One raid alone saw Every's men slaughter hundreds of pilgrims en route to Mecca, igniting a global manhunt. But the true giants of piracy were Asian fleets. Chinese pirate lords commanded armadas of hundreds of ships, dwarfing anything in the West. The most famous Qing Shi, a woman who rose from prostitution to command 70,000 men, ruled the South China Sea with iron discipline. Her code forbade theft from villagers, punished disobedience with execution, and rewarded loyalty with wealth. In the Indian Ocean, pirates exploited the crossroads of trade, striking ships carrying silk, spices, and jewels. They clashed with European navies, Arab traders, and Indian rulers alike. Unlike the Caribbean, piracy here was interwoven with empires, religions, and massive fortunes. These eastern pirates remind us that the story of the outlaw sea is far larger than the myth of buried treasure and Jolly Rogers. From Africa's coasts to Asia's shores, men and women lived and died by the same harsh laws of hunger, greed, and survival. The cruel hierarchy of pirate crews. Popular imagination paints pirate ships as utopias of freedom, men voting on captains, sharing loot equally, living free of kings and masters. And indeed, pirates did experiment with democracy, but beneath that veneer, hierarchy and cruelty still thrived. The captain held supreme authority during battle. His word determined life or death. A good captain was respected, a bad one often mutinied against. Outside of combat, the quartermaster was arguably more powerful, overseeing supplies, discipline, and the division of loot. He could flog, restrain, or even depose the captain if the crew willed it. Yet not every pirate had a say. New recruits, prisoners forced into service, and enslaved Africans pressed into labor had little voice. These men lived at the mercy of veterans. Punishments were severe. Stealing food or cheating at dice might earn a whipping, while betrayal or cowardice could mean death. The democratic myth also breaks down when it came to wealth. Yes, shares were often more equal than on naval ships, but captains and officers still claimed double or triple portions. Injured men might receive compensation, like extra coins for a lost arm. Yet these sums rarely replaced a life's worth of survival. And beneath all, violence ensured obedience. Mutiny was possible, but it was bloody. Crews might maroon unpopular leaders, abandoning them on desolate shores with a pistol and little else. Others were stabbed, shot, or thrown overboard. So while pirates mocked the tyranny of kings, they often recreated miniature kingdoms aboard their ships. Freedom, like everything at sea, was fragile, and only lasted as long as the crew tolerated it. Disease, the silent killer. Far deadlier than cannonballs or hangings, disease stalked pirates endlessly. Life at sea was a breeding ground for sickness, and medical knowledge of the 17th and 18th centuries was woefully primitive. Scurvy was the most infamous. Caused by lack of vitamin C, it left men weak, their gums bleeding, teeth falling out, and bodies wasting away. Entire crews sometimes collapsed into uselessness, ships drifting helplessly. But scurvy was only the beginning. Dysentery swept through cramped quarters where sanitation was impossible. Typhus and smallpox rode on lice and rats, leaving fever, delirium, and death. Malaria struck in tropical anchorages, draining men's strength until they could barely lift a. Wounds were almost always fatal. A musket ball or sword slash could fester in filthy conditions. With no antibiotics, infections spread rapidly, turning a minor injury into a death sentence. The ship's surgeon was often little more than a butcher with crude tools, ready to amputate limbs with saws and cauterize stumps with hot iron. Quarantine was impossible. When disease struck, entire crews wasted away, some too weak to man sails. Ships became floating coffins, left adrift until storms or starvation finished what illness began. Even the most feared pirate captains fell victim. Blackbeard himself may have suffered from syphilis, its slow torment affecting his mind. Henry Morgan's men withered from fevers on their infamous Panama March. In truth, the sea's greatest enemy was invisible, a reminder that the most terrifying battles were not fought with steel, but with rotting flesh and failing breath. Marooning, a fate worse than death. For a pirate, one of the cruelest punishments was marooning, being left on an uninhabited island, armed with only a pistol, a flask of water, or nothing at all. It was both execution and torture. The sun beat down mercilessly by day, freezing winds howled at night. With no food but crabs or roots, marooned men starved slowly. Some clung to life for weeks, eating insects, drinking rainwater, even gnawing leather. Others succumbed within days, but the mental toll was worse. Endless silence, no hope of rescue, no human voice but one's own. Madness often struck before hunger. Men spoke to shadows, carved marks into rocks, or ended it all with the pistol left as mercy. Yet, some survived against all odds. Stories tell of pirates who managed to catch fish, build fires, and even signal passing ships. Alexander Selkirk, a marooned sailor, lived for years on an island in the Pacific, inspiring Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, but such survival was rare. Marooning was both a warning and a form of justice among pirates. Crews used it against captains who abused power, against thieves who stole from their comrades, or against cowards in battle. It was democracy's cruelest weapon. To be marooned was not just death, it was abandonment, a declaration that you no longer belonged to the Brotherhood of the Sea. Few fates terrified pirates more. The false promise of treasure. Ask anyone about pirates, and the first thing they'll imagine is buried treasure. Maps marked with X's, secret caves filled with gold, chests brimming with jewels. But reality was far harsher. Pirates did capture treasure, sometimes immense wealth from Spanish galleons or Mughal ships, but gold was quickly divided and squandered. Wages were spent on rum, gambling, prostitutes, and luxuries denied in ordinary life. Within weeks, many pirates were as penniless as before. Buried treasure, meanwhile, was mostly myth. Pirates rarely buried loot. Why? Because stolen goods needed to be spent or traded fast before authorities caught them. The idea of treasure maps was popularized later, through fiction like Treasure Island. Most pirate hauls weren't gold at all, but mundane cargo: sugar, tobacco, textiles, spices, tools, useful, profitable, but hardly romantic. Crews would sell stolen goods to corrupt merchants, often for far less than their true value. There were exceptions, of course. Captain Kidd famously buried treasure on Gardiner's Island, fueling legends for centuries. But for most, wealth was fleeting. The sea demanded constant risk, and fortune slipped away as quickly as it was seized. The harsh truth: piracy was rarely a road to riches. For every captain who died rich, hundreds more died poor, hanged, or abandoned. The promise of treasure was a cruel illusion, one that kept desperate men risking everything, but rarely rewarded them. The legacy of fear. By the early 18th century, governments had declared total war on pirates, and while the pirate era ended, their legacy lived on, not in freedom, but in fear. Harbors once teeming with lawless crews became watchful, with gibbets displaying corpses as grim reminders. The very word pirate became synonymous with savagery. Sailors, even honest ones, were eyed with suspicion if they strayed near outlaw waters. The romance of piracy, so beloved today, was built on centuries of horror. For coastal villagers, pirates were not heroes but raiders, men who burned homes, stole children, and slaughtered innocents. For merchants, they were ruin. For navies, they were traitors to order itself. Yet the legends endured. Ballads sang of brave outlaws, pamphlets exaggerated their cruelty, and storytellers kept alive their names. Blackbeard, Kidd, Anne Bonny, villains to some, rebels to others, symbols of freedom to many. In truth, pirates left little behind but bones beneath the waves, ruined towns, and the faint echoes of laughter shouted into storm winds. Their world was short, brutal, and merciless, and that is the final cruelty of piracy. The very thing men risked everything to join, in the end, devoured them. Torture at the hands of pirates. Pirates were not only victims of brutality, they often wielded it. When they captured ships, prisoners faced interrogation, and pirates had many cruel ways to make men talk. One method was sweating, prisoners locked in a tiny airless space, forced to stand in unbearable heat until they collapsed. Another was the dreaded keel-hauling. Bound with rope, a man was dragged beneath the barnacle-crusted hull of a ship. If he survived being torn to shreds, he often drowned anyway. Others faced the infamous walking the plank. Though less common than stories suggest, pirates sometimes forced men to leap into shark-infested waters. More often, prisoners were whipped, beaten, or hanged from the yardarm as warnings. Captains seeking to terrify victims sometimes mutilated corpses, leaving them dangling at harbor entrances. Blackbeard himself tied fuses into his beard, his face a mask of smoke and fire, designed to make enemies surrender before a fight even began. Torture was not always about cruelty alone, it was strategy. By spreading fear, pirates broke resistance before it started, but the price was reputation. Pirates became not legends of freedom, but demons in the minds of their prey. Women of the pirate world. Most imagine pirates as men, but history holds stories of women who lived this brutal life. Anne Bonny and Mary Read disguised themselves as men to join pirate crews. Fierce, ruthless, they fought alongside male comrades, shocking enemies when their identities were revealed. Life for women in piracy was complex. Some joined willingly, chasing freedom from restrictive societies. Others were captives, forced aboard against their will. Relationships formed, sometimes consensual, often coerced. In port towns, women were essential to pirate economies. They ran taverns, sold goods, and worked in brothels that pirates flooded with stolen coin. These women walked a razor's edge between survival and exploitation, dependent on lawless men who might as easily destroy them as enrich them. Legends grew around the few female captains, but their lives were rarely glamorous. Anne Bonny was captured and imprisoned. Mary Read died of fever in her cell. Their stories survived because they were rare, the exceptions in a world dominated by violence and men. Women in piracy embodied the contradictions of the age. Symbols of rebellion, but also reminders that freedom was often a mask for cruelty. The psychology of pirates. Why did men, and occasionally women, choose such a brutal life? The answer lies as much in psychology as necessity. Most pirates were former sailors, abused by naval captains or starved by merchant masters. To them, piracy offered escape from oppression. But once aboard, survival required a shift in mindset. Violence became normal. Death was constant, morality blurred. Psychologists today might call it trauma bonding. Crews grew close through shared suffering, laughing in the face of storms and musket fire. Camaraderie numbed the fear. Alcohol and superstition also shaped pirate minds. Rum dulled the pain of wounds and grief. Belief in omens and curses gave meaning to the randomness of death. Some carved charms into their weapons, others tattooed protective symbols on their skin. Yet beneath bravado, fear always lingered. Every raid risked the noose. Every voyage could end in storm, disease, or betrayal. Perhaps that is why pirates lived so recklessly, burning through life before it could be taken from them. In the end, piracy was not just crime. It was a psychology of desperation, forged by men who had little left to lose. The great pirate hunters. As piracy spread terror, nations unleashed their own answer. Pirate hunters, naval captains, privateers, and ruthless mercenaries were tasked with wiping out the scourge of the seas. The Royal Navy grew more organized, sending heavily armed ships to patrol trade routes. Captains like Woodes Rogers, governor of the Bahamas, turned pirate havens into traps. Rogers offered pardons to those who surrendered, and merciless justice to those who refused. Privateers, once pirates themselves, switched sides. Men like Benjamin Hornigold hunted their former comrades for profit. Knowledge of pirate tricks made them effective and deadly. Captured pirates rarely survived trial. Courts moved swiftly, condemning dozens at once. Executions became public theater, with spectators cheering as men swung from gibbets. Heads were displayed on stakes along harbors, a grim reminder that the age of piracy was ending. The hunters were not noble heroes. They plundered, enslaved, and killed with as much cruelty as the pirates they pursued. But their relentless campaign worked. By the mid-18th century, piracy as a global force was broken, its survivors scattered or dead. The final end of the pirate age. The so-called Golden Age of Piracy lasted less than a century, but its myth has lasted far longer. By the 1730s, pirate havens had fallen, captains were executed, and ships rotted in forgotten harbors. Yet the legacy of piracy was not erased. Sailors sang sea shanties of bold captains. Writers spun tales of treasure maps and hidden islands. Children played at being pirates, turning horror into adventure. The truth, though, is darker. Being a pirate meant hunger, fear, wounds that never healed, and death that came young. Few found treasure. Fewer still died in their beds. Most ended at the end of a rope, bodies swaying in the salt wind. And yet, perhaps that is why the legend endures. Pirates lived without bowing to kings, priests, or lords. They spat in the face of empire, if only for a brief moment. Their lives were short, brutal, but defiantly free. So the next time you hear the romantic tales of buried gold or gallant rogues, remember the truth. Being a pirate was not an adventure, it was a sentence. A gamble where the sea, disease, and death almost always won. And that concludes our long voyage into the brutal reality of piracy. If you thought pirates lived glamorous lives of treasure and freedom, you now know the darker truth. Their world was far harsher than fiction ever admits. If you enjoyed this deep dive into forgotten history, make sure to like this video, subscribe for more long, immersive history, and ring the bell so you never miss a new journey into the past. Share this with anyone who loves history, and let them discover that sometimes, the stories we think we know hide the most brutal truths. Until next time, stay curious. And remember, calm seas hide stormy histories.